welcome to lesson 2. Now this is going to be the first lesson on algebra. Algebra is a very important topic in the G.C.S.E mathematics, and you'll need more than one go at it. So I'm starting with, well, what I hope are the easier aspects of algebra. First thing we need to be able to do is to do algebra, solving equations by the method that I call balancing. Now other teachers might well have other expressions for this method, but I call it balancing. When you have an equation, as long as you do the same thing to both sides of the equation remains balanced. So we need to do the same thing to both sides of an equation and it will remain balanced. Let's look at some examples. So, balancing equations. If we add the same thing to both sides of an equation, the equation will remain balanced. Let's look at these two examples. So if I have 3x minus 5 equals 4, and I add the same thing to both sides, the equation will remain balanced. Now I can add any number you like to both sides. For example, let's add, let's add 10 to both sides. If I add 10 to this side of the equation, and that means adding 10 to the minus 5, that will give me plus 5. And if I add 10 to that side of the equation, it will give me 14. Adding 10 to both sides of the equation, this equation is still correct. Not terribly useful, but still correct. Let's go back to the original equation, and let's add 2 to both sides. If I add 2 to this side, it means adding 2 to the minus 5. So if I add 2 to this side, I'll actually get this. Adding 2 to that gives me minus 3. And adding 2 to the 4 gives me 6. I can add anything I like to both sides of the equation. Again, not terribly useful. But if I add 5 to both sides of the equation, if I add 5 to this side, I'll get 3x. And if I add 5 to that minus 5, it will actually cancel the minus 5 out. I must add 5 to the other side. Now I do mean literally add any number you like to both sides of an equation and you've done something that is acceptable. But certain values will give you a very good result. Look at this equation on this side. Add anything you like to both sides of this equation. Let's add 2 to both sides. If we add the number 2, the 4a remains the same, so I add the number 2 to the number 3, and I add 2 to the number 15. This is perfectly correct. There is nothing wrong with it at all. Adding a number to both sides of the equation is a very good move, but certain numbers are more useful than others. Let's have a look at this with subtraction. Let's look at this equation. Well, this one's adding to both sides of the equation as well, so let's add to both sides of the equation on this one. So let's add to both sides of this equation. If I add 8 to both sides of this equation, let's see what happens. If I add 8 onto the minus 8, then in fact it will cancel. And if I add 8 to the other side, it leaves me with 15. That's the result of adding both sides with 8. Adding 8 to both sides of the equation. Let's look at this one. Add to both sides of this equation. Nothing wrong with adding to both sides of this equation. Let's add 2 to both sides of this equation. If I add 2 to this side, adding 2 to the 5 will give me plus 7. Adding 2 to the 23 will give me 5. Adding to both sides of the equation is a good idea, but sometimes it gets you a bit further than other times. Okay. Let's look at subtraction. Subtracting from both sides of the equation at the same time. Let's take this equation. Subtract any number you like. from both sides of the equation and it remains an equation. Let me subtract 2 from this side of the equation. That means subtracting the number 2. So I subtract the number 2 away from the number 5. If I subtract the number 2 away from the number 5, that will give me minus 7. If I subtract the number 2 away from the number 4, that will give me 2. This is perfectly correct. Not getting us very far, but it's perfectly correct. Let's try subtracting both sides of the equation. Let's subtract 5 from both sides of the equation. If I subtract 5 from the left hand side, that means 5 minus 5 subtract 5 will give me minus 10. Subtract 5 from the minus 4, so subtracting 5 from both sides of the equation is correct, but it isn't getting us very far. Let's have a look at this equation over here. Now let's subtract 3 from both sides. Let's subtract 3 from this left hand side of the equation. Then 4a will remain the same. If I subtract 3 away from that 3, it'll cancel out. And if I subtract 3 away from the 15, I'll get 12. This is not only right but very useful. So I can add or subtract as long as I do the same thing to both sides of the equation. Some moves are more useful than others. Okay, let's see what else we can do. We can also multiply both sides of an equation by the same value. Multiply both sides of the equation by the same value. Now this here says x over 2. Means x divided by 2. This says a half x. Now in fact both these questions are exactly the same. It's just a different way of writing the same thing. This says x divided by 2 is 6. This says a half of x is 6. Now I can add to both sides of these equations. I can subtract both sides of these equations. Won't get me very far. Let's see what happens if we multiply both sides by 2. If I multiply both sides of this equation by 2, a half x multiplied by 2 is 1 whole x. I multiply the 6 by 2. That in fact gives me the answer to the question. The question we're trying to do is, what is the value of x? The value of x is 12. So multiplying both sides of the equation by 2 gave us the result. Let's see what happens if we multiply both sides of this equation by 2. Multiply both sides of the equation by 2 will give you 4x on that side and 12 on that side. Perfectly correct, but not getting us very far. So the point I'm making is you can add, subtract, multiply both sides of an equation by any value you like and you will be correct. Just that in some cases you're getting nearer to the answer. Let's look at another couple of examples of multiplying both sides of the equation. This says x over 4 equals 5. What is x? That's the same as saying a quarter of x is 5. Let's multiply both sides of that equation by 4. 4 times a quarter, 4 quarters is, as we say, 1 whole one. So 4 times a quarter x is 1x. So if I multiply that by 4, the left hand side by 4, I'll have to multiply the right hand side by 4 as well. This actually gives you the answer to the question. What is the value of x? X is 4. You can always check it. A quarter of 20 will give you 5, or 20 divided by 4 will give you 5. Multiplying both sides of the equation by any number you like will be correct. Let's multiply both sides by, I don't know, 7. 7 times 4x. 7 fours, 28. 7 times 5. Again, perfectly correct, but not getting us very far. So, sometimes we might need to divide both sides of the equation by the same number. Let's